All right, so good morning, everybody, on this very freezing morning, but very nice to see you all. Very nice to welcome you to another CANRAD and Iscia collaboration. And I'm not going to spend too much time just saying anything. I'm going to say hello, which I've just done, and then I'm going to hand you over to Christy to introduce our speaker. She's going to introduce herself as well. And yes, welcome. Very glad to see you all here. Christy.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Yes, welcome to everybody. My name is Christy van der Westhuizen. I'm an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy here at Nelson Mandela University. And this is actually the third webinar that we are co-hosting with Andrea, who holds the SACHI chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa, particularly in relation to COVID-19. So it's about thinking together through the pandemic. And what we've done in the previous webinars that we've co-hosted were to look at the criminal justice system, and particularly the question of state violence, whether looking at the police, whether looking at the military, looking at questions of a resurgence perhaps in authoritarianism and so forth. So it was very much a contemporary lens. This week we are turning our lens to make sense of the previous pandemic that's comparable to this particular situation. The last time that a pandemic of this kind of proportion hit South Africa was 100 years ago, and that was in the form of the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. So we thought it would be useful to cast our view further back into history, and to try and get a bit of a sense of how did that pandemic play out in South Africa. Of course, one can't make easy comparisons, but I do think it's useful for us to understand, particularly because there's so much information also on the global north and on the United States and Europe and elsewhere, where the COVID-19, for example, is playing out in far less information here. So I think it's important for us to also bring in that South African lens, and then also bring it also down to the Eastern Cape. If we look at the Spanish influenza pandemic, we see that 3% of the world population died in that pandemic. In South Africa, it was double the number at 6%. So that's particularly interesting. And there were particular sub-regional dynamics that we are also interested in, and that will hopefully be illuminated today. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Howard Phillips, who will be speaking to us on Black October, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919 in South Africa. Professor Phillips is an Emeritus Professor in History and Public Health at the University of Cape Town, and he has written several books looking at the Spanish influenza pandemic from different angles. So I'm very excited that Professor Phillips agreed to speak with us today and to share his considerable knowledge on the subject with us. And you have hopefully seen his very, very abbreviated biography in the invitation, but he was on the staffs of the Departments of History and Public Health at the University of Cape Town for 40 years, and there he pioneered the teaching of medical history in both those departments. And the focus of his work is very much on disease and medicine, and particularly the history of disease and medicine. And some of the works that he's produced in the process include In a Time of Plague, Memories of the Spanish Flu Epidemic of 1918 in South Africa, and also The Plague, Pox and Pandemics, A History of Epidemics in South Africa. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Professor Phillips to address us for the next 30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Christy, and sorry, Howard, sorry for interrupting you, but could I just mention one or two practical things before we begin? One of them is that there are quite a few participants, so what we would very much like you to do is, as the talk progresses, would you pose your questions in the chat session? You'll see at the bottom of your screen there's an icon that says chat, and what you can do is just write a question there to everyone. And what we'll do then is just go through those questions as they come in after the talk and pose them to Howard that way. Yeah, other than that, please remember that this session is being recorded and your participation in it is a kind of acknowledgement of that. Okay, so just those two practical things. Thanks very much, Howard, for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning to NMU and others, and thanks to NMU and CANRAD and Iscia for the invitation. What I thought I would do is really start wide and then focus in more specifically. So talk initially a little bit about the Spanish flu globally, and then look more particularly at South Africa, and then particularly at the Eastern Cape. And in that way, try and give you a sense of the wider picture and then the more specific and precise. So let me start by just explaining what was the Spanish flu pandemic. And of course, a pandemic is an epidemic, but on a global scale. Epidemic is an unusually large outbreak of a disease in one country or in one region. A pandemic is that outbreak pretty well globally. So here we are talking about a pandemic, rather like COVID-19, spans the world. And quite simply, Spanish flu, and I'll explain that label Spanish presently, the Spanish flu was the worst pandemic in modern history. It carried off, and we don't know the figures for sure, and we probably never will, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people in just over a year. To put that into perspective, World War I, which was coinciding with the year of the Spanish flu, World War I, 1914, 1918, 4.5 years. World War I probably was responsible for about 12 or 15 million deaths in the space of 4.5 years. Spanish flu in just over 1 year, 50 to 100 million deaths. So it gives you a sense of both the magnitude of the Spanish flu and also the speed at which it moved around the world. In the space of just over 1 year, it spanned the whole of the world, being responsible for so many deaths. To make some sense of the Spanish flu, let me track its spread, its origin, and its spread. First thing to remember is that the Spanish flu consisted of three waves of the disease, and they were not of equal severity. The first wave began, insofar as we can tell, at a military camp in the Midwest of the United States. The United States had entered World War I in 1917, and so there were a large number of military training camps spread throughout North America, throughout the USA. And in one of these, in Kansas, in March 1918, it began. And this was the first wave. The first wave was very infectious. It spread rapidly, but not all that deadly. It laid people low who contracted it for a couple of days, perhaps a week or two, and then gradually they recovered. So this first wave was one which began, insofar as we know, in the Midwest at this military camp, and then spread, as these arrows indicate, from one military camp to another military camp to another military camp, and then to the troop ships carrying US troops across the Atlantic to fight in World War I on the Western Front in France and in Belgium. And from there, you can see the arrows indicate to elsewhere in Europe, to the Middle East. Generally, it did not affect Africa, except perhaps parts of North Africa and of Northeast Africa. But, and this is important, right at the end of the first wave, in September 1918, the tail end of this first wave just came in through Durban and went up to the Witwatersrand. But that really was at the very end of this first wave. As you can see elsewhere on the map, it spread to Latin America and it spread westwards from the US to China. So this was the first wave, and important to remember, infectious, very infectious, and but not all that deadly. When it affected Spain, Spain was not at war in World War I. Spain was neutral. And so the Spanish press, unlike the press in the countries which were at war, France, Germany, the United States, Britain, the Spanish press covered the outbreak extensively, particularly because the King of Spain, Alfonso XII, went down with it. So it was a big press issue. And so it seemed that it was Spain where it began. But as this map indicates, that's not at all the case. And the label was attached by other countries to say it's Spain where it began. It's the Spanish flu. But that's a serious misnomer, but it has remained in place till today. And my Spanish colleagues are a bit ambivalent about this. They say, well, it didn't really begin here. On the other hand, it focuses attention on what was happening in Spain. But do bear in mind that the very label is indicative of many things that happen in epidemics generally. Where do epidemics begin? They don't begin with us, they begin over there. We are always pointing fingers when it comes to epidemics, not unknown right till 2020. It's a standard practice in human history. We want to know who's responsible, and we always say they are, not us. So that's the first wave. The second wave, very different. As you can see on this slide, the second wave was global. And the important thing to remember is that the second wave, also very infectious like the first wave, but the second wave was lethal. The second wave was not just spreading widely and laying people down for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. The second wave killed, and killed very quickly. And that's because almost certainly what was happening after that first wave had spread to Europe, somewhere in July, August 1918, that virus began to change quite fundamentally. Virologists use the term mutate. It mutated very considerably, adding to its infectiousness a lethality, an ability to kill, which that first wave did not have. And that's the real big killer. The Spanish flu second wave, which emerged in sort of August, September 1918, and then spread worldwide, killing people on a massive scale. And that's the wave which eventually hit South Africa and caused what contemporaries referred to as Black October, a devastating month or 6 weeks in which probably 300,000 South Africans, it's about 5 or 6% of the South African population, died. South Africa was probably the third or fourth worst hit country in the world in terms of death. And there are reasons for that, and I'll talk about that a little later. Reasons which go right to the heart of the nature of South African society and economy. So there was also then a third wave. The second wave ran from about August, September 1918 till the end of the year or early in 1919. And then a third wave appeared in the middle of 1919, much less disastrous than the second wave. And that pretty well ebbed, so that by the end of 1919, the Spanish flu had probably already begun to disappear. The reason is probably because it had infected so many people. Those who were infected and survived had immunity to it. And so very rapidly, a large number of people with immunity to the disease began to build up, and a disease like influenza needs susceptible people to continue to rage. And that number of susceptible people diminished rapidly. It is in effect what today we are referring to as the acquisition of herd immunity. So if these were the patterns of the Spanish flu, first wave emanating in the US, very infectious, not all that deadly, and then mutation somewhere in July, August 1918 to a second wave, very infectious but deadly, running through to the end of the year, beginning of 1919, and then a third wave in 1919, infectious but not all that serious, though it did, it seems to me, probably carry off the first Prime Minister of South Africa, Louis Botha, died in August 1919 of what contemporaries called he had contracted some kind of chest infection. No one was very specific, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that Louis Botha died in this third wave of the Spanish flu. So if we're trying to make some sense of this absolutely rampaging pandemic, we need to know a little bit about the virus itself. So let me just give you a little bit of virological information about the virus. What was it? Why was it so lethal? Well, the first thing to remember is that influenza virus is a virus which the natural home, the natural habitat is in water birds. Over many, many centuries, the virus, the influenza virus and water birds have reached a sort of accommodation. It can survive in water birds without killing them, and only when it passes from a water bird to other birds or other animals and eventually to humans does it really begin to gather pace and momentum and become epidemic and eventually pandemic. This is very much known as crossing the species barrier, and you will know that in the case of COVID-19, that is regarded as probably how COVID-19 began and then transferred to humans. So influenza virus, somewhere before 1918, began to move from water birds into other animals and then into humans. I suspect, and it's not proven, that this was already happening from about 1915, because there are a couple of reports of unusual incidents of influenza in different parts of the world, 1915, 1916, 1917. And it's not really surprising if you think that this is in the midst of World War I, with huge numbers of young men overcrowded in military camps, on troop ships, in prisoner of war camps, moving around under stress, clearly providing lots of opportunity for an individual to infect someone else. And characteristically, the way in which the influenza virus is spread is either by coughing or by sneezing. And here are two statistics which really will surprise you. When you cough, an ordinary cough, you probably are spewing out about 3,000 droplets, which travel at the speed of about 50 miles per hour. So if that cough is from someone infected with a virus, that's probably 3,000 droplets, some of which are carrying the virus, and they spread at 50 miles per hour. And if you thought that was dangerous, if you sneeze, you're probably putting out about 30 to 40,000 particles, 30 to 40,000 droplets, which travel at about 200 miles per hour. So you can have a very clear sense that people in close proximity to each other, whether they are in a military camp, whether they are in overcrowded living conditions, are really very, very much at risk of being infected by one person, just one person who has influenza and is coughing or sneezing. What was characteristic about this 1918 virus is that it went almost immediately down into one's lungs. The usual pattern with an influenza virus is that it lodges in your upper respiratory tract, in your nasal passages. For reasons which are not clear, this virus had a distinctive character to actually go straight down into the lungs and there to really cause mayhem, because it infected the lungs and consequently began to impede breathing. And then as individuals' immune systems began to respond to this foreign body, this foreign presence in the lung, so the immune system would begin to pour into the lungs liquid to try and damp down, to remove, to exterminate this foreign body. And very often it was this response of the immune systems which filled lungs with liquid, which seriously impaired breathing. And so people who went down with Spanish flu very rapidly had their breathing restricted and consequently had more and more difficulty in spreading oxygen around their bodies, and in many cases, horrifically, began to turn blue and black from lack of oxygen. Here's a contemporary painting, it is, of a Spanish flu patient, and you can see his face is turning what they called heliotrope, the color of sort of light purple. And this was very characteristic of the Spanish flu, often also in fingers and toes, one's extremities. This was the real killer. This was the dimension of the Spanish flu, which really was responsible for that 50 or 100 million deaths. This is really the source of what we understand by Black October. What is also unusual is who it killed. Now, normally, as I think most people will know, seasonal influenza is a disease which puts the greatest risk on those people whose immune systems are not well developed, i.e. young children, or those whose immune systems have begun to wane, the elderly. Those are the people who are normally at risk from ordinary seasonal influenza. Quite different with Spanish flu. Have a look at, this is a page from the cemetery register in Kimberley. Kimberley was probably the worst hit city in South Africa from Spanish flu in 1918. And here you will see 1918, October, just 2 dates, 13, and then down at the bottom it begins to have deaths on funerals on the 14th. Here's the name of the deceased, and then look at their ages: 20, 36, 24, 29, 29, 29, 38, 29, and so on. The very group of people whom you would expect to be healthiest, who you expect to be most robust, were those who were dying in large numbers. And this poses a real question, conundrum for virologists and pathologists today. Why were the group of people who were most affected in terms of deaths, not contracting, but in terms of who died, young adults, largely between the ages of 18 and about 40? The suggestion at the moment is that this was the case because in young adults, the immune system was most robust, was most energetic. And so when it responded to the presence of the Spanish flu virus in the lungs, it overreacted and consequently flooded lungs with liquid causing deaths. And so quite unusual, but this is a global feature of the Spanish flu, is that the highest number of deaths were in the category young adults. And that has very important social implications about which I'll talk presently. You can see this put up onto a graph. Here is a graph showing death rates in the United States. The broken line is the average for the years 1911 through to 1917. And at the bottom here, you can see ages. And you can see high infant mortality. And then from age 5 onwards, mortality is relatively low. And then in old age, it begins to pick up. That's the average for 1911 to 1917. Look at the 1918 graph. High infant mortality, yes, as is usual. And then age 14 upwards, it suddenly begins to soar exactly where you would not expect it to do so. And that's because of the Spanish flu deaths in that young adult category. The consequences of this are enormous in terms of labor, economy, and also something I'll flag now because I'm going to talk about it presently, and that is the death of large numbers of young parents. What are the social and implications of that? Okay, so that's something by way of the wider picture. Let me now turn to Spanish flu and South Africa. That second wave, which began to emerge in Europe in August, September 1918, really manifested itself in 3 major World War I ports: Brest in France, Boston in the United States, and then Freetown in Sierra Leone in West Africa. From about late August 1918, troops, many of them being returned home to the United States or being returned to South Africa or Australia, troops on troop ships leaving Europe carried second wave Spanish influenza. And so the second wave hit the United States via Boston. And then in September 1918, 2 troop ships left the UK, left Britain, carrying South African troops, taking them back home to be demobilized. And these 2 troop ships, on their passage to South Africa, stopped off in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where the second wave was raging. And it's pretty clear that some of those troops and the crew on those 2 troop ships contracted the disease there. And the 2 troop ships then moved to, landed in Cape Town. And in Cape Town, the troops were disembarked. And it's very clear that only very cursory quarantine precautions were taken, because very soon these troops were being put onto trains and allowed to return home. And here's a list, because they were troops, there were details kept of where they were headed. Here's a list of, from several pages, of where the destinations of these troops leaving Cape Town in September 1918. And if we look just at what was still then being called the Cape Colony, even though it's the Cape Province, you'll see that many were returning to the Eastern Cape from their stint in, on the Western Front in World War I. There are people, 37 being returned to Butterworth, 49 to King Williamstown, 74 to Maclear, 44 to Lady Grey, 20 to Port Elizabeth, 48 to Umtata. So a significant number of these returning troops were boarding trains, many of them infected, and as they reached their home station, so they disembarked, carrying the Spanish flu with them. Here you can see the South African railway system, which really is the core of understanding why the Spanish flu spread so rapidly and so extensively in South Africa. In 1918, South Africa had by far the best developed railway system in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's, of course, for deep-rooted economic reasons. And it was via this railway network that the Spanish flu spread very rapidly indeed. One can track almost on station by station by station the Spanish flu appearing a day or two after there had been troops had been returned and disembarked. The mortality in South Africa was indeed very extensive. As I said, 300,000 South Africans or thereabouts died in the space of about 6 weeks. If we have a look, there's the mortality map. The darker shading indicates higher mortality. And you'll see a pattern here pretty well corresponding to the railway network. If I go back to the railway network and then to this mortality, here you can see more or less a pattern from Cape Town along the railway line up. There's Kimberley, desperately bad situation, and then particularly from the big railway junction at Daar, a large number of deaths southeast of Daar, particularly in the Eastern Cape. If I give you some comparative figures or percentages, just to give you an indication of how bad the mortality was, how high the mortality was in the Eastern Cape. In Port Elizabeth, about 4.5% of the population died. In Pedi, 6.5%. In the Transkei, of Mvaba, 8%. In Libode, in Transkei, 8.6%. At Kaiskamahoek, 10%. And in Alexandria, 12%. So we're talking about a region of South Africa which was especially hard hit, especially the Transkei. And I think the reasons for that are really twofold. One, it was an area which was already significantly impoverished. Agriculture had already begun to feel heavy strains through the loss of young men migrating to work on particularly the diamond mines and the gold mines, Kimberley and the Witwatersrand. And then many of these young men fleeing from the disastrous death trap of Kimberley and fleeing from Johannesburg, returning home using this extensive railway network and bringing the flu with them to a population which was already, whose health was already compromised by several decades of poor harvests, of impoverished living conditions, of economic distress. What is perhaps intriguing is if we zero in on the Eastern Cape, those are the most heavily hit areas, as you can see. But away here in the eastern part of the Transkei, the mortality from the flu was relatively light. It stands in very striking contrast to the surrounding districts. And there is perhaps a very challenging question to which I can suggest an answer. Why were these most easterly districts of the Transkei relatively lightly affected? Well, we need to go back just slightly to recognize that what was then the province of Natal itself was relatively lightly infected, hit by mortality. And that's because as I mentioned right at the beginning, the tail end of that first wave of the epidemic, which was very infectious, but not all that deadly, just reached Durban ahead of the second wave coming in through Cape Town. And from Durban, it spread to other parts of the then Natal province, and particularly to the Witwatersrand. Here, you'll see which relatively lightly affected compared to surrounding areas. And it spread along the railway line. So I think that what we have here is, in a sense, an indication of the connection between these areas in the eastern Transkei and the neighboring Natal province. And that connection is even more apparent if we look at a close-up of the railway network. Here's that railway network. There's Durban, Maritzburg, and you'll see there's a spur line which goes through Port Shepstone into the eastern parts of the Transkei. And similarly, a spur line from Maritzburg down to Tabankulu in what's happened to my cursor? Down to Tabankulu. And those are the areas exactly which were more lightly affected than the areas which were linked to the railway line from the west, i.e. the railway line coming down from De Aar and originally from Cape Town. So I think here we have, in a sense, almost a classic case study of the difference between being infected by the first wave, surviving and having some immunity, which was the experience, I suggest, of the eastern districts of the Transkei, and being infected only for the first time by the deadly second wave, which was the experience of most of the Eastern Cape and the Transkei, to go back to that. So here I think we have an explanation about differential impact of the Spanish flu in the Eastern Cape and then even within the Eastern Cape. Elsewhere in South Africa, particularly Cape Town, Kimberley, Bloemfontein, De Aar, it was a disaster of huge proportions. I'll just show you a couple of contemporary photographs and this very, very dramatic cartoon from Die Burger in Cape Town, the 16th of October, 1918. The angel of death marked Spaanse griep, Spanish flu, on its journey, with the Table Mountain in the background, on its journey around South Africa, causing deaths on an enormous scale. Here's a very poignant photograph of a widow of a Dutch Reformed Church dominee in Merweville in the Karoo. He was 39 years old. He died of Spanish flu, and here's his widow with the 4 flu orphans. And that picture would have been multiplied time and time and time and time again throughout South Africa. How did the government respond? Well, there was no Department of Health. There were just 3 men in Pretoria who made up a sort of sub department. There was no Department of Health. And so it fell very much to the local authorities to try and do something in the face of this tsunami of the epidemic. Here's a list from Johannesburg of municipal food and medicine depots set up around the city to try and provide soup, food, and some hastily made medicine which wasn't of any use at all, because doctors really didn't have any antidote, any treatment which was effective. Here is one of these emergency depots. This is the then Governor General, Earl of Buxton, and you'll see all these little children have brought buckets and cans to take home milk or soup or even food. In Cape Town, queues round and round the City Hall. The City Hall in Cape Town, that's the City Hall in the background. City Hall was another one of these emergency depots providing food, soup, medicine. People queuing up. Notice not one of them is wearing a mask. In the Natal province, an emergency tent hospital outside Newcastle. Again, not a single person wearing a mask. Mask wearing does not seem to have been the norm in South Africa. Lots of contemporary photographs from the US that we see suggests that masks were there, well used. There's not evidence of that in South Africa. So what were the longer term consequences of this catastrophe, of this unprecedented catastrophe in South Africa? South Africa is no stranger to epidemics. It's got a long history, well before 1918, but nothing even matches the magnitude of the disaster and the speed of the disaster of the Spanish flu. So what were the longer term consequences of that? Well, very obviously, first of all, 300,000 people died, and particularly young people, people who should have been at the heart of the economy. We should also bear in mind that because pregnant women, for physiological reasons, were especially vulnerable to Spanish flu, we should add to that 300,000 an unknown number of babies who were not born in 1919 because their mothers had died in pregnancy or because they had been stillborn or aborted. Indeed, when we look at the educational statistics in the 1920s, in 1925, the enrollment into what today would be grade 1 was markedly down, and contemporary educational authorities said, this is strange. Why is there a sudden dip in the number of new admissions to school in grade 1? What the reason is if you track back, these should have been people born in 1919. They were not born in 1919, and consequently the dip shows up in the educational statistics. And indeed, that dip carries on right through the whole age bracket for the rest of the century. Secondly, of course, as I indicated, the Spanish flu left flu orphans on an unprecedented scale. This poignant picture of 3 kids whose mother had died. You need to multiply that again. I cannot put a figure on how many orphans were created, but I would guess we're talking about something of the order of 900,000 orphans created in South Africa in the space of less than a month. How does a society cope with that deluge of orphans? Well, a whole range of responses. There was institutional response. The Dutch Reformed Church established rapidly a special fund to provide for flu orphans, to expand orphanages, to build new orphanages. Amongst many South Africans, however, these orphans were incorporated into extended families. But think of the emotional, psychological impact on these orphans, 900,000 of them. Just to give you a hint, I spoke in the 1990s to an elderly man, he was nearly 90, who was a flu orphan. He said, I was 8 years old in 1918 when my mother died. And he said to me, and I have missed her ever since. So how do you cannot quantify what the impact on him was in emotional, psychological terms, but we do know that he was traumatized in a significant way, a cloud pretty well carried through his whole life. And then, of course, the Spanish flu has left no large memorials, no large monuments, nothing like World War I. To die in the Spanish flu was not heroic. It's not a heroic issue like dying in World War I or in a war or in some kind of politically connected event. Here's, again, a poignant memory of the way in which families were shattered. This is a gravestone from Cradock in the Eastern Cape to 2 brothers, the Botha brothers, Gebroeder Botha of Doornhoek Farm, who both died on the 25th of October, 1918. Multiply that countless times of families shattered by the death of a father or mother or both. This is the Eastern Cape dimension. Those of you who know the Port Elizabeth Public Library may have seen a plaque up on the wall. This is a memorial to people, volunteers in Port Elizabeth who died in the Spanish flu in the midst of, as it says, ministering to those people who had contracted the Spanish flu. Another consequence, perhaps entirely unanticipated, was the way in which insurance companies responded. Insurance companies paid out significant amounts to the families of those who had died in the Spanish flu. But in the wake of the Spanish flu, and with all the medical experts saying it's going to come again, it's going to be a repeat, the insurance industry embarked on the most vigorous advertising campaign to sell new insurance policies. Here's an advert which appeared in the cinemas of South Africa in 1919. A woman, a widow, a flu widow with 3 flu orphans. Notice this one on her suitcase has got SOS. And this is the result if you don't insure. The consequence of this vigorous campaign by the insurance company was phenomenal. In 1919, the insurance industry in South Africa sold more new life policies in percentage terms than it has ever done since within a similar period. So here's a completely unexpected and unanticipated consequence. And then finally,
so good. Sorry, I was about to interrupt you and say people are dying to ask you questions.
Okay,
chatting.
Here's the last slide.
All right, Fab, thanks so much.
I said that the memory of the flu is not something which is well recalled. Here is a contemporary song written in isiZulu by Ruben Galuza, lamenting the deaths in the flu. Here's the isiZulu version, and here's the English version, poignant and recalling exactly what I've talked about. In 1918, an influenza epidemic spread like wildfire throughout the country. It took with it many lives. Our beloved mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers died. At some homes, not a soul survived. Beautiful daughters, handsome sons, bonny babies, engaged girls, and newly married couples passed away. Old and young perished, and darkness ruled over all the earth. Parents left their young ones uncared for and in great grief. Nevertheless, it was so with those who went to Canaan. Despite the hardships they experienced, they persisted in praising and magnifying the names of their Maker. Therefore, youth, let not hearts be troubled, for there is no complete happiness. So here you have memory in melody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I know I'm speaking on behalf of everybody because people are muted, but that was absolutely fascinating presentation. Very grateful for you to have been here. What I'm going to do is just go through the chat and pick up on the questions as they've come in, and maybe just pose them to you as they come along. So one of the first things that Stephanie Kemp would like to know, probably all of us did at some point, this did strike our minds, was she says, when we say that Kimberley was probably the worst hit city, her question is, well, is this among whites? The cemetery registers of white names? How were the deaths among Africans recorded? And in anywhere in South Africa? That was something that struck me too. All of the photographs are of white people. Well, yeah, could you respond to that?
Okay. The records are very much white focused, the written records. So the cemetery register that I picked up is the one best documented, but by no means is it a disease which affected predominantly whites. Quite the reverse. If you look at the figures are overwhelmingly black and colored deaths. The white ones, however, are the ones which are given the nature of the official statistics at the time, most fully documented. Kimberley is a particular case because Kimberley's very large population of miners were buried largely on the ground, in the grounds of De Beers mines. And I am told, I was not able to get access to the De Beers would not give me access to their archives. I am told that a huge pit was dug on in the grounds of De Beers mines, and bodies were piled in there of miners. So a huge number, certainly in several thousands of miners buried on De Beers properties in Kimberley. Elsewhere, the figures are estimates from local magistrates, and that's why the figures are always of the order of, or something like, because local magistrates were really dependent on rumor, what they were being told, what they heard second and third hand. But tellingly, one of the ways in which I tried to get a figure was not to do a count of how many were recorded as having died at the time, because the official figure is half that of what I've quoted. The official figure is 142,000. But I tried to get at the figure in a different way. I looked at the 1911 census, and then the next census was in 1921. And then I projected forward from the 1911 figures what at the average population growth rate would the population have been, ought to have been in 1921, and then looked at the 1921 figures. And the 1921 figures are about 500,000 fewer than you would have projected. And then you look in particular areas, and Transkei in particular is about 100,000 fewer than you would have projected. And it's on that basis that I have reached a conclusion, a figure of about 300,000. So one really has very imperfect evidence, and one has to use bits and pieces to try and patch together an overall picture.
Thanks. So what I'm getting from you there is the kind of, at least the racial discrepancy reflected the colonial attitudes of the time. We're hoping that that's not going to be the case now in COVID. We'll see how that compares. So
Andrea, sorry, it reflects something else. It reflects
yes.
That, as I said, a very large number of people contracted the disease. Oh. Their race was generally not a barrier to contracting, but the difference comes in who then died of the disease. Ah. And given that the medical profession, doctors, really didn't have very much by way of antidotes, probably the best way of surviving the epidemic, if you had contracted it, was by good nursing. And so the question is, who could afford good nursing? And it's those people who could afford good nursing and people who did not have to go out back to work. Because one of the many pressures of the time was no work, no pay. And so particularly young men, very much having families dependent on them for income, were inclined to get up too soon or to say, oh, it's flu, I'll be okay, go to work and be carried home in a coffin.
Oh, okay. Yes. All right. Thanks for that clarification. So one of the questions, this comes from Gary, is that, well, are there any thoughts on why we haven't actually memorialized the deaths from Spanish flu? Because we tend to glorify the people killed in wars and conflict. Why did we kind of, in a certain sense, forget about this massive...
I think we need to actually disaggregate that question. It's not memorialized at an official level. And the reason is, I think, fairly clear, because to die of Spanish flu is not heroic. It's not something that you want to pay tribute to every year. So at an official level, that plaque in the in the Port Elizabeth Public Library is one of the very few, maybe there are 3 or 4 in the country. Contrast that with the number of memorials to people who died in World War I or World War II. It's a different league. But the other reason is, of course, that medically, it's a complete disaster that doctors and the medical profession do not want to remember the Spanish flu because it is a defeat of huge proportions. And so you won't find doctors say, ah, yes, this is what we did in the face of the Spanish flu and we conquered it and we managed to prevent it. Quite the reverse. It's a very considerable rout of the medical profession. So where you might expect it to be remembered within some kind of institution, you won't find it. However, at a personal level, at a family level, it is remembered. And any number of people who lived through it, as I indicated, I interviewed a very large number of people back in the 1970s, people who were 70 and 80, and they poured out their memories. And still today, you will find people saying, oh yes, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather, they died in the Spanish flu. So you've got a rather different area where it is remembered at a personal level, at a family level. But at the national level, at the official level, almost complete silence. And that's true not just in South Africa, that's true across the world.
Interesting. Howard, we're kind of shifting towards running out of time, but there are two very important themes that are coming through in the questions now. One relates to racial relations, which you've touched on. The other relates to, I think in a way, quite a big question with us is that parallels with COVID. I think one of the questions that cropped up with us is, do you think there's going to be a second and third wave COVID that we need to be afraid of? And are there parallels that you can draw between that situation and our situation? So those two, they're quite different topics. I'm not sure if you want to comment on either one of them.
Yeah, sure. An important dimension of epidemics generally, and I've already referred to this when I talked about the label Spanish. An important dimension is that what epidemics do, and not just 1918 and not just COVID, but epidemics generally across the world, it's very well recorded in human history, and I think it's a facet of human response, is that it opens up and reveals fissures and fault lines in society. In the face of life and death, you don't easily mask those divisions, those fragmentations in society, and they come up and strike you in every way. And consequently, in 1918, the underlying attitudes of whites to blacks, of blacks to whites, really became very, very marked indeed. But they're not uniform. There are those who recognize that assistance and cooperation across the racial barriers was something quite remarkable, and that in itself is telling, and they praised that. They were enormously grateful, and there are many examples of people saying this was an unusual occasion for cross-racial assistance. Indeed, one of the elderly people whom I interviewed back in the 1970s said, whites, he was a colored man, whites assisted us then in a way which was quite novel. And then he said, but they were not the whites of now. This is in the 1970s. On the other hand, it also deepened suspicion and hostility. So there are those who say they are to blame. They are deliberately doing this to try and significantly limit our numbers. Many blacks said this is actually part of a general white plot to try and diminish our numbers. And that goes to the underlying suspicion, the underlying animosities in a society. You must also remember that medicine and hospitals, Western medicine, missionary hospitals, were by no means accepted across the board as places where you would go to if you were ill. Indeed, hospitals often had a very negative connotation amongst many black South Africans. And so in those cases, there was sense that this was another attempt to try and diminish the black population. So what an epidemic does is really, in very stark terms, show up divisions in a society for good and for bad in a way which perhaps under more usual circumstances are not so apparent. With regard to the question of COVID-19, well, some features we can see replicated straight away, and I've referred to it several times, a stigmatization. Chinese disease, it's the Spanish flu, it's always them. That is a very standard human response. We've seen it in HIV/AIDS, we've seen it in TB, we see it very widely indeed. And so that, I think, is part of almost, I think, we are hot-wired to respond in that way. With regard to the question of COVID-19 undergoing change, I don't think anyone can say what's going to happen. We don't know if the coronavirus will mutate in the way that the Spanish flu virus mutated. We are being told by virologists that the coronavirus is more stable. In other words, it pretty well remains as it is. I hope that that's true, but I quite simply don't know.
Okay, thank you so much. We're actually at the end of our time, and I think I don't know is an absolutely perfect note to end up on. But what I would like to do is ask Zandile Tose to just in a way say thank you to you for being here.
Okay.
I'm going to open up her now.
Sorry, I just want to put up on the screen the other book. That's the one overview of epidemics in South Africa. And this is the one which brings together all the memories which I collected in the 1970s from flu survivors. Thanks, Andrea.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that will be, I think, a very moving kind of book. So yeah, so again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very, very much. And Zandile, would you be able to put your video on so that we can see you? There, awesome, thank you. I'm going.
Is it on?
Hi, Zandile.
And you're there.
Oh, hi.
I can hear you.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. Well, my name is Zandile Tose. I am a research assistant from the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. And on behalf of CANRAD and also the Saatchi Chair for Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa, we'd like to extend our vote of thanks to you, Prof. Phillips, for a very informative session. I believe that it was much needed in these times as we try to understand and also survive the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also appreciated, Prof, when you were drawing parallels between the COVID-19 and the Spanish influenza, especially when you were speaking about, you know, how it started, the influenza started in Kimberley, but also because of the railway lines, people were able to move out of the province, going back to the Eastern Cape, which might have also contributed to the high number of infections there. You know, because we also saw it when the lockdown regulations were announced in South Africa. Quite a number of people moved out of the Western Cape. They moved out of Gauteng and all other provinces, going back to the Eastern Cape, you know, which may also contributed right now to the high infections as we see in the Eastern Cape. Also, I would like to thank, you know, the people who made this webinar possible, colleagues from the Saatchi Chair, Prof. Hurst and Herschela. Also from the CANRAD side, you know, thank you to Prof. Van der Westhuizen, thank you to Simphiwe Zondani and Dr. Ranch. And most importantly, I would also like to thank, you know, colleagues who actually took time out of their schedules and joined us for this webinar and contributed to this informative session. Thank you so much, colleagues, as we try to think together through this pandemic. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Stay in good health, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And if you would like to just show us your face before you sign off, we'd love to see you. It's actually very nice to have a few faces popping up so we can just wave, say goodbye for a few minutes. Lovely to see you, Adi. Hi, Ethan. Hi, Gary. Hi, Christy.
Won't be from US.
Hi, good to a whole lot of people come in. So thanks again very much for joining us. And yes, what we will be doing is actually taking a break for next week. Apparently our dean has said to us that next week is a good time for all academics to take a break. So we won't be having a seminar next week, but we will start again the week after with again another personal account of somebody who has gone through the COVID process and is very unhappily sitting out the Black Lives Matter protests because of this. It's a person from the US. So it'll be very interesting to have a different perspective of somebody who's gone through this process in the US. So that's what we'll do, not next week, but the week after. But thank you all for joining. And yes, signing off. We will see you soon. Cheers.
Bye.